Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Today, I will be speaking about racialized surveillance in the 18th and 19th centuries by discussing the social history of the silhouette and the technology of the candlelight. My main object of interest for this talk is the ledger book of William Beisch, an object that resides in the National Portrait Gallery's collection here in DC. I'm currently a second-year master's student studying art history at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, and this talk is a portion of the research for my thesis, which will be completed in the spring. Okay. An installation image from the National Portrait Gallery's 2018 exhibition, Blackout, Silhouettes Then and Now, shows an oversized book laid out on a gray stand encased in a glass vitrine. Secured by transparent straps, the book opens to reveal a neat grid of silhouette profiles against its worn off-white pages. Identified as the ledger book of William Beisch, this book served as a means to preserve and record the cutout portion of 1,846 hollow-cut silhouettes made by Beisch between 1803 and 1809. William Beisch was an Englishman who immigrated to Philadelphia and established himself as a silhouettist. Beisch found success in his trade during his travels to the southern states, and the ledger was primarily produced in Northern Virginia and New Orleans. Before the invention of the daguerreotype in photography in 1839, the quick, affordable, and accessible silhouette was the most popular form of portraiture around. With the aid of a physionotrace, a portable easel-like device used to make the silhouette, silhouettists like Beisch were able to move from town to town by foot, horseback, train, or boat, and make profile portraits of people from all walks of life. A reproduction of the ledger book found on the National Portrait Gallery's website presents detailed photographs of the book's covers, select pages with silhouettes, and pages recording the names of each sitter. Its accompanying text reads, Beisch's patrons cut across socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic lines, including numerous New Orleans tradespeople, civil servants, their families, as well as portraits of enslaved African Americans. Herein lies a contradiction. The National Portrait Gallery's categorization of enslaved African Americans as Beisch's patrons reflects a misunderstanding of the function of the silhouette, suggesting the ledger book to be an objective and modest representation of selfhood requested by each sitter. Unlike silhouettes of white individuals, silhouettes of the enslaved were not presenting them as self-determined beings. They were being presented as officially categorized chattel. These silhouettes were made not at the bequest of the sitters or their loved ones, but under the denigrating, humiliating set of operations that constituted the Atlantic slave trade. Acknowledging that the spatial and constitutive coordinates for the silhouettes of the enslaved individuals are entirely distinct from those of whites opens another way of viewing. When placed in conversation with the Portrait of Flora, the Book of Negroes, and the Lantern Laws of 1731, the ledger book of William Beisch can be seen as an archive that simultaneously operates as a record of Beisch's itinerant practice and as a 19th century biometric technology of Black surveillance and subjugation. The silhouettes produced in the ledger book of William Beisch are related to a longer history of silhouette portraiture dating back to 500 AD, with Pliny the Elder's recount of the origin of painting. Here, David Allen depicts the story with two entwined figures sharing a seat. A single lamp next to the male figure illuminates, while the female companion paints the outline of his shadow onto the wall. In order to preserve the image of her lover as a memento, she produced a silhouette. Since its origins, the silhouette has functioned as a means to memorialize a loved one. The physionotrace, able to produce the person's likeness in the matter of minutes, was a quick and cheap alternative to oil painting. With the invention of the physionotrace and the circulation of Johann Caspar Lavater's popular text, The Physiognomic Fragments, silhouettes became widely popular in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Silhouettes of white Americans circulated as domestic heirlooms, viewed in maple frames and lovingly arranged in albums passed down for generations. This silhouette of Emma Catherine Embury by well-known cutter Auguste Edouart depicts the figure as an authoress by including the shadow of a book in her hands and spectacles on her nose. White subjects depicted in silhouettes were offered as individuals worthy of fine furnishings. These sitters retained specified subjectivities and were valorized within social hierarchies. In contrast, Flora's portrait, a crude, hollow-cut silhouette plastered onto darker paperboard, was found in a Connecticut cellar alongside her bill of sale. The paper has discolored and it is creased, suggesting it was kept folded away for years, hidden away alongside other business documents of the Benjamin family. Alan Sekula writes, "Only the photograph could begin to claim the legal status of visual document of ownership. However, with Flora's silhouette, we can understand that even prior to the invention of photography, the significance of the enslaved person's portrait was solely a proprietary one. They were displayed at auction blocks, reproduced as runaway slave advertisements, and shown at pseudoscientific lecterns. The silhouettes of the enslaved individuals are more vessels of transient information that expose their subjugation rather than portraits." Although silhouettes are devoid of detail, for white sitters, this was compensated by the ways in which they were created as objects of affection and subsequently how they were kept as familial documents. Through their external display and care, these silhouettes retained their biographical specificities outside the objects themselves. Silhouettes of Black sitters lacked such compensating externalities, and instead they can be read as a blacking out of their personhood. The minimal level of detail constitutes an adequate visual description to sell them, to track them down after escape, to be the property of another. It is crucial to recognize how the specific externalities of the silhouette's production become influential in terms of how the object was valued and understood. In this case, the ledger book of William Bache can be read as an archive with receipts, listing clients and their purchases rather than an objective album of silhouettes. The final pages in the ledger book of William Bache reveal an archival practice. In his cutting process, Bache would fold a piece of paper twice so that when he cut the tracing, 4 copies would be produced. Bache would then record the name of the sitter, coat the cutout head with black ink, and paste it onto the ledger, matching it to a numbered grid on the page. In 4 neat columns, each page lists nearly 200 names. The result is an index of every client Bache had between 1803 and 1809, an advertisement and log of his silhouette practice. For the enslaved, however, the ledger can be seen as a searchable database for the future tracking of the Black body and as a record of the current name of the individual's proprietor. When viewed alongside the Book of Negroes and the Amistad captives, the ledger book can be seen as an archival document that evidences the accounting of Black people and is intimately tied to the history of surveillance, specifically the surveillance of Black bodies by means of identity documents. Handwritten and leather bound, the Book of Negroes is a military ledger that lists 3,000 Black passengers who left New York during the British evacuation to Nova Scotia after the American Revolution. The passengers listed in the book traveled either as indentured laborers to the Loyalists or as free people. In comparison to the ledger book of William Bache, the Book of Negroes contained no visual data, and while both archives reported names, the Book of Negroes made quick assessments of each subject, sometimes by way of corporeal descriptors, the age, the status, the destination of the individual. The ledger, in its accounting for humans as commodity in the enterprise of racial slavery, according to Saidiya Hartman, introduces another death through its shorthand. The Black body here is made legible with the modern passport system. In this instance, the Book of Negroes is both a record of escape and evidence of how the surveillance of Black Atlantic mobilities was integral to the formation of the US-Canada border. The Ledger Book of William Bache, on the other hand, by labeling names to what was understood then as objectively captured portraits, can be seen as an early form of facial recognition technology. Both the Book of Negroes and the Ledger Book of William Bache offer an historicizing of the ways in which the tracking, accounting, and identification of the Black body form an important part of the genealogy of the passport. While the Ledger Book was a system of Black surveillance regulated through the recording of Black bodies, the restriction of Black mobilities was more widely circulated in the form of runaway slave advertisements. Through both forms of tracking rely on the written word, the fugitive slave advertisement used visual data, in many instances with the silhouette, alongside detailed descriptions in order to render the already hypervisible Black subject legible as out of place. Through its production and circulation, these advertisements transformed their readers into part of what Simone Brown calls an imaginary community of surveillance. A page from the history of the Amistad captives, compiled by John Warner Barber, depicts 6 silhouettes of Africans. The silhouettes are labeled by numbers, which correspond to each individual's name, followed by biographical and descriptive information. Moru, number 13, for example, is described to be 5'8" with full Negro features. Similarly, a runaway slave advertisement published September 1807 shows a silhouette of Sancho, who is described as a Negro man 30 years of age with very Black complexion, and he's a fast walker. Runaway slave advertisements not only ascribe these physical and biographical details to the Black subject, they also offered the slave owner's assessment of the fugitive's character. This kind of judgment, written alongside the silhouette, suggests an affinity of the slave's character with their likeness, upholding popular 18th century pseudoscientific principles of phrenology and physiognomy. The assumed white subject, when viewing these newspaper advertisements of Black fugitives, are training what Steve Mann calls the body-born camera and recording device. Composed of the eye, the mind, and the brain, the body-born surveillance tech was trained to watch, observe, and regulate the out-of-place Black body. The specific ways the silhouette of the enslaved functioned, as business documents and runaway slave advertisements, reveal how 18th and 19th century practices of identifying, accounting, and recording are intricately tied to knowing the Black body and subjecting them to high visibility. In addition, technologies used to produce the silhouettes in the Ledger Book were, in another instance, used and enforced by law to render the out-of-place Black body hypervisible and trackable in panoptic fashion. Like any other silhouette produced in the 19th century, William Bache used the physionotrace to trace the profiles of his sitters. In order to produce the silhouette, individuals would sit between the easel-like device and a lit candle or lantern. Shadow produced against the physionotrace would then be traced on the opposite side by the silhouettist. In this case, the candle made the silhouette possible, and furthermore, if the sitter was Black, the light translated the facial profile into visual data. Historically, light has been used as a supervisory device. In medieval Europe, the process of surveillance at night was set in motion once a lantern was lit. To be illuminated in the dark was to be exposed defenseless to the gaze of the other. When looking at 18th century lantern laws, one can see how the technology of light made it possible for the Black body to be constantly illuminated, knowable, locatable, and identifiable. In Jeremy Bentham's plan for the panopticon, small lamps work to extend into the night the security of the day. The use of light as surveillance was regulated in medieval Germany, as night watchmen in towns were required to carry torches on their rounds. Here, the light of the torch both lit the way and made their bearers, the forces of order, visible. Citizens, if needing to venture into the night, were also required to carry a light. In the darkness of the night, light acted as the identity document. Anyone not carrying a light was regarded as suspect and immediately arrested. In the case for New York City, nearly 300 years later, a law for regulating Negroes and slaves in the nighttime, also known as lantern laws, used Bentham's application of light as a supervisory device for regulating Black and Brown mobilities at night. The law, printed on broadside in 1731, states, "No Negro, mulatto, or Indian slave above the age of 14 years is permitted to appear in the streets of New York City unless in the company of his or her master, some white person, or a lantern or lighted candle, so that they can be plainly seen. Any slave convicted of being unlit after dark was sentenced to a public whipping of no more than 40 lashes." Here, the lantern is a kind of prosthesis, a technology that sought to render those who could be criminalized as outside the category of human. For medieval Europe, the lit torch signified the overseer, and in colonial New York, the lantern was a form of knowledge production about the Black, Indigenous, and mixed race subject, a body being branded by light. The dual function of light can be understood here as an instrument of surveillance and mark of identification that exposes one to the surveillance of others. Just as a silhouette functioned differently for white Americans, the process of tracing the profile with the use of light, while an innocent act for white sitters, was another development in the history of Black subjugation and the surveillance of Black mobilities. The ledger book of William Bache, runaway slave advertisement of Sancho, and the lantern laws of 1731 are all technologies of seeing that are racializing in their effects. From the candle flame to the white gaze, these technologies were employed as an attempt to identify who was in place with permission and who was out of place with censure. Although not called lantern laws today, policing tactics using light have not changed much. Present-day methods, instead of utilizing the candle lantern, involve the militarization of high-intensity floodlights. In 2014, Mayor Bill de Blasio brought 150 high-intensity floodlights to 15 housing developments in New York City. A strategy dubbed omnipresence, these lights, equivalent to 200 times the brightness of a car headlight, would point directly at apartment windows, flashing from dusk to dawn. These lights, de Blasio says, would light up the areas that have been obscure and problematic and make it easier for the NYPD to do its job. The areas that were described as obscure and problematic are neighborhoods like the Bronx and Brooklyn that are known for having a larger Black and Brown population. A study published in 2020 outlined how disproportionately these strategies, which were understood to replace stop and frisk policing practices, affected communities of color. Described as an abrasive glow cast over the city's poor, these lights beamed into children's bedrooms, and the loud buzzing noise of the generators keep residents awake at night. Since the introduction of omnipresence, physicians at the American Medical Association have issued guidelines on the detrimental effects of high-intensity lighting. And furthermore, the Center for Victims of Torture have outlined sensory overstimulation, including powerful lights and constant noise, to be a form of torture. Since the implementation of this strategy, the mayor's office, the New York City Housing Authority, and the NYPD have continued to install additional lights in housing projects despite concern from physicians and community members alike. As of 2016, High-intensity flashing lights have been installed in over 40 developments across New York City. Light has historically and continues to be weaponized as a technology of surveillance in Black communities. Alongside the advancement of light technology, the silhouette continues to be used as visual data to criminalize the Black body. On September 11th, 1970, Life magazine issued a publication featuring on their cover a profile of Black political activist Angela Davis. Rendered in black and white, her head is lowered with her eyes looking upwards. Embedded in her hair are the words, "The Making of a Fugitive." The article that featured Davis, entitled "The Path of Angela Davis, a Radical's Journey from a Promising Childhood to a Place on the FBI's Most Wanted List," attempted to pinpoint how a woman of her intellect became such a sad and terrible story. The posters that circulated in conjunction with the release of this publication reproduced her portrait as a silhouette. Angela Davis's silhouette, framed by smiling portraits of President Nixon and his administration, reveal a visual affiliation to the runaway slave advertisement. In this instance, the silhouette of the Black subject continues to be used to render their bodies as criminal and threatening. The silhouette and the light that informs its production are embedded in and continue to develop in the histories and technologies of slavery that sought to govern Black people on the move. Recognizing how the silhouette and technologies of its production differed across racial lines situates the ledger book of William Beish into the long history of Black enslavement, racial surveillance, and practices of captivity. When Sarah Beish Blois, a descendant of William Beish, donated the ledger book to the National Portrait Gallery, it had already been passed down for 2 generations. As of 2022, the Portrait Gallery has begun a project to research, catalog, and photograph every silhouette in the ledger with the aim of creating a public digital archive. Rerouting the study of the ledger, whether it be in the individual silhouettes or through the silhouette practice, through the history of racialized surveillance, opens up possibilities for fugitive acts of escape, resistance, and the productive disruptions that happen when Blackness enters the frame. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? First, I thought that was amazing.
Thank you.
But I was just wondering how common it was to see silhouettes made of enslaved African or African Americans in general as compared to white people in sort of the 18th and 19th centuries. Like, do you have any indication of how common it was to see them in newspaper ads as compared to runaway ads that are just text, etc.?
I was not able to find any evidence of just for like personal use. There is an instance of Moses Williams, who was a cutter, but that history is also a little bit suspect to me. But primarily what I've been able to find is very little information on Black silhouettes. Yes.
How many, well done, that was great. How many Black sitters are in the beach book out of 1,000 plus?
And can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry, how many Black sitters are virtually?
Oh, yes. So the question was how many Black sitters are in the Beish book? There's no way for me to find out. So when I was working on this paper, had the same question, but then it felt really uncomfortable for me to look at silhouettes and determine the race of the silhouette. The names are, I don't know if they're like, I would have to go through every single name and try to figure out whether or not they had slaves and then match it. And the issue with the book is the National Portrait Gallery won't let me see it in person because the pages are laced with arsenic, which is really interesting. But that's for my thesis. I hope so. And I hope that when they publish it all that maybe some families will be able to figure out. There's pages that are actually very interesting. I'll show you at the very end that are cut, and areas here where the face has been removed, if you can see. And I've been able to find through private collections and some dealers the actual silhouettes that come out of the book, but they're like reframed.
How was this book used? And did you cover that? Forgive me, I missed it.
The question was, how is this book used? From what I know, this book was just a catalog of it was like a receipt book and catalog of every single client that he had. So he would, when he made the silhouette, it was a piece of paper and you would trace it and then fold it multiple times. So he would give, kind of like when you take school photos, you print them out in wallet size, have multiple of them, and then he would keep one as, okay, this was, I did it at this time. Yeah. Yes.
So with very interesting presentation, and with regard to some of these silhouettes being used for a sort of more commercial accounting purpose relative to enslaved people, with other forms of property, you'll see similar records being updated periodically.
Mm-hmm.
With usually when something goes, is inherited, they might update descriptions, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you? I mean, I don't know how you could deliberately search for this within that data set, but have you come across any silhouette where it is updated? You see, oh, this is
Mm-hmm.
the same family and the same enslaved person, and here's a new silhouette of that person
Mm-hmm.
years later or something to that effect.
So the question to summarize is, have I found any silhouettes that have been updated through purchases? Or
Yeah,
So-
a redoing of a person's silhouette.
Yes. There isn't a redoing, but in the case of Flora's profile, there's a little area on the bottom, you can barely see it, where her last name was erased and then her new name, Benjamin, was written. So it was kept as, okay, this is property. And then as we sell this slave to somebody else, we erase the last name, put your last name is now your property. Yes. So that is one of the instances.
That's super interesting, because that also suggests that this was not just one owner's
Mm-hmm.
sort of that is part of the bill of sale.
Yes.
That goes with
Yes.
the enslaved person when ownership transferred. Yeah.
It was folded together with the paperwork. Yes.
So since this is part of your thesis, you're still working on it, what avenues are you continuing research into now going forward?
So the question is, what avenues am I researching into going forward? So I'm actually writing a little portion on the materiality of it, that it's laced with arsenic, it's a deadly object. I think that's quite interesting. But the areas where there are profiles cut out, I'm actually writing a kind of speculative fiction, kind of like Sadia Hartman, and thinking about what would happen with redaction, photographic methods of redaction. Would that be in a way of kind of regaining personhood, or redaction as an act of protest, removing yourself from the archive? So I didn't include in this presentation, but Kara Walker, in her silhouettes that she does, the large murals, she has a figure that is the negress, which is this little girl, and she's holding a pair of scissors. And I imagine that in the speculative fiction, she's cutting herself out of these kinds of records. So removing herself as a form of regaining her personhood, regaining identity as an act of protest. So that is the avenue I'm going forward with.